The first thing Nora Holt heard when she opened her eyes was a man dying. Not a fast death. A slow one. The kind a man makes when his body has decided before his mind has. And the sounds coming out of him were low and wet and wrong in a way that settled into the stomach and stayed there. She was lying under the wagon with her face in the dirt and the smell of gunpowder still thick in the cold morning air. And she did not move, because the men who had done the shooting were still in the yard. She had counted 4 of them when they rode in before dawn. She counted 3 now, which meant one was inside the house. Her husband Walt was the man dying in the yard. She knew it was Walt because she knew the sound of him the way a woman knows the sound of rain on her own roof. Different from all other rain, particular and unrepeatable. 22 years of marriage had made his voice a thing she could identify in darkness or at distance or, as it turned out, in extremis. Walt, she thought. Walt. Her mouth shaped the word, but her throat would not give it air. She pressed her lips to the dirt and breathed through her nose and made herself count the horses by their feet. 3 horses standing. One was Walt's gray, shifted nervous against the fence post where she had watched him tie it yesterday morning when all of this was still ordinary life. The man inside came out. She could hear his boots on the porch boards. Deliberate. Not in a hurry. A man who owned the ground he walked on or believed he did, which amounted to the same thing in practice. He stopped in the yard. The sounds Walt was making stopped too. Nora pressed her face harder into the dirt. She breathed. She counted. She did not move. Someone is going to know about this, she thought. Someone is going to know every face and every name and every word that passed in this yard this morning before the sun came fully up, and they are going to answer for it in a court of law or in a grave, and those are the only 2 options because those are the only 2 that Walt would have accepted. She thought of the other thing. The thing under the porch step that Walt had put there 6 months ago on a Sunday afternoon when he came home from town with a face like a man who had looked at something he could not unsee. She lay still and she waited and she breathed and she filed away every detail she could observe from 4 inches off the ground, because there was nothing else she could do for Walt now, and doing nothing at all was not something she was built for. The men rode off inside the hour. Nora did not come out from under the wagon for another 30 minutes after that. She had learned patience the hard way over 61 years of living, and she was not going to spend it carelessly now. When she finally crawled out and stood up, her knees were stiff and her back was a complaint from top to bottom, and she did not give either one any particular attention. She looked at Walt. She looked at him a long time. She said his name once out loud. She knelt beside him and closed his eyes with her thumb the way she had seen it done, and she sat with him for a little while in the thin morning light with the horses shifting and the birds starting up in the cottonwoods along the creek. Then she stood and she went to the porch step. The board Walt had told her about was the 3rd one from the left. It lifted with a flat knife blade worked into the seam. She had never opened it. She had known where it was and she had never opened it because Walt had said, "Open it if something happens to me," and nothing had happened to Walt in 22 years, and she had grown comfortable with the idea that nothing was going to. Under the board was a tin box. In the tin box was a folded piece of paper, a pocket watch that had belonged to Walt's father, and a letter in Walt's handwriting addressed to a man named Calhoun Reese in the town of Blanton, 2 days' ride to the northeast. She unfolded the paper first. Walt's handwriting, careful and square. He had never been a man who hurried his letters. She had always loved that about him. The paper had 6 names on it. 6 names, and beside each one, in Walt's careful hand, the words deed, date, amount. 6 land transactions. 6 families who had sold their land inside the past year. Walt had written one word at the bottom of the list, and the word was wrong, and he had underlined it twice. She folded the paper back. She put the watch in her coat pocket. She tucked the letter inside her dress against her skin where it would be warm and where she would feel it if anyone reached for it. Then Nora Holt went to saddle her horse. She had 4 miles to go before she reached the Dunbar place, which was the nearest neighbor, and 20 miles after that to reach the road that would take her northeast to Blanton. She was 61 years old and her knees ached, and the man she had been married to for 22 years was lying in the yard of her own home with his eyes closed, and she could not bury him herself because she was not strong enough to dig the ground alone, and also because leaving him unburied felt like an abandonment she was not yet ready to commit. She rode, and she did not cry, and she did not look back. which cost her something she would measure later when she had the time. The Dunbar place was a low-slung ranch house with 3 dogs and a woman named Cecily Dunbar, who had known Nora since before Nora had been Holt. Cecily met her at the gate with both hands up and the look on her face that people get when they can already read the shape of bad news in the posture of a body before a word is spoken. Nora told her quick and plain. Cecily did not say "I am sorry" or "I cannot believe it" or any of the other useless things people say. She said, "Come inside and eat something," and then she said, "What do you need?" and those were the right things in the right order. What Nora needed was for someone to go back to her place and sit with Walt until the ground could be worked. Cecily's husband Ned would do it. He was a quiet, decent man who had helped Walt build his first barn and who would not leave a friend lying in a yard. What Nora needed was 2 days' worth of food and a fresh horse if Cecily had one to spare. The bay she had been riding was a good horse, but he was 7 years old and 2 days hard was asking more than she wanted to ask. Cecily had a young roan she had been working since spring. She brought him out and saddled him herself without being asked again. "Nora," Cecily said, standing at the gate with the roan's reins in her hand and the morning sun beginning to throw real light across the yard. "Who are you riding to?" "A man named Calhoun Reese." Cecily's face shifted. She looked at Nora carefully. "You know that name?" Walt wrote it down. Then Walt knew something. Cecily said it quietly. He knew something and those men knew that he knew it. "Yes," Nora said. "I believe that is the shape of it." "Then you ride careful," Cecily said. "You ride the ridge roads. You don't take the valley flats where a person can see you coming from a mile. You hear me?" "I hear you." "And Nora." Cecily put a hand on the roan's neck and looked at her friend. "You sure about this? I can send Ned's boy into town. There are other ways to get a message." "There are other ways," Nora agreed. "But there is only one way I can look at myself in a mirror afterward, and that way involves me delivering Walt's letter to Walt's man with Walt's paper in my own hand. You understand?" Cecily looked at her a long time. Then she said, "I always did think you were the braver one." Nora said nothing to that. She took the roan's reins. She rode northeast. The ridge roads were longer and harder and she covered them without complaint. She had grown up in this country before there were proper roads of any kind, when the only way to move from one place to another was to read the land and let it tell you where it was willing to be walked, and she had not forgotten that reading. She watched the sky and she watched the tree lines and she did not ride into open ground if she could find any kind of cover to flank it. On the evening of the first day she stopped at a line shack she remembered from 30 years back. It was still standing, barely. The roof had gone soft in one corner and there were birds living in the rafters and the stove was rusted past use. But the walls were 4 of them and the door had a bolt and she was tired in a way that had more to do with grief than with miles. She ate cold biscuits and drank creek water and sat with the tin box open on her knees and looked at Walt's handwriting in the last of the light coming through the one window. She had met Walt Holt at a church social in the summer of her 39th year, when she had already resigned herself to the idea that her life was a settled and solitary thing. He had been a big, quiet man with large hands and a habit of listening all the way to the end of a sentence before he spoke, which was so rare in a person that it had startled her the first time she noticed it. She had spent 22 years being startled by him in small good ways. The last startlement was the tin box under the porch step, which told her that Walt had known something dangerous for 6 months and had carried it alone without burdening her, and she could not decide if that was love or stubbornness or both, which was probably the right answer. She closed the box. She lay down on the floor of the line shack with her coat over her and her hand on the tin box, and she slept a hard and dreamless sleep that she did not wake from until the birds in the rafters started up at first light. She rode the second day faster. The roan was a good animal, willing and even tempered and better on rough ground than she had expected. She named him in her head on the second morning and then took it back because naming other people's horses was a thing that led nowhere useful. She thought about the 6 names on Walt's list instead. She thought about what wrong meant, underlined twice. She thought about what a man had to see or hear or discover to make him write a letter addressed to a stranger and hide it under his own porch step. She reached Blanton in the late afternoon of the second day. It was a bigger town than she had expected. A main street with a livery and a hotel and a land office and a courthouse with a clock tower that was reading 10 minutes slow. She had always noticed clocks that were wrong. Walt had said it was because she was a schoolteacher's daughter, and her father had believed that being on time was a form of respect. She asked for Calhoun Reese at the livery, while she handed the roan over to be watered and fed. The liveryman looked at her with the careful face of someone who keeps his information behind a door and decides who to open it for. "Ma'am," he said, "what is your business with Reese? My name is Nora Holt. My husband was Walt Holt. He sent me here." The liveryman's face changed. He came around the horse and lowered his voice. "Walt Holt from down on the Granger Flats?" "Yes, ma'am." He looked at her with something that was not quite pity and not quite alarm and landed somewhere between. "Ma'am, is Mr. Holt?" "He is not," Nora said quietly. "He was shot in his own yard 2 mornings ago. I have a letter for Reese from Walt and I am going to deliver it. Now where do I find the man?" The liveryman looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Office above the hardware store. 2nd floor. Tell him Graves sent you or he may not open the door." She thanked him. She walked to the hardware store. She climbed the stairs on the side of the building that were narrow and steep in the way of all stairs built as an afterthought, and she knocked on the door at the top. Nothing happened. She knocked again. A voice from inside said, "Who is it?" "My name is Nora Holt. Graves sent me. I have a letter from my husband." A long silence. Then the sound of a bolt being drawn and the door opened 6 inches and a man looked out at her from the gap. He was 50 or so, with gray in his hair and a beard that had not been tended in some weeks and eyes that were sharp in the way of a man who has been sleeping light for a long time. "Mrs. Holt." His voice came down to nearly nothing. "Walt Holt's wife." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "You know my husband?" "I know the name." He looked past her, both ways along the street. "Come in, please." "Fast." She came in. He bolted the door behind her. The room was small and cluttered in a purposeful way, with papers sorted into piles she could see had an order to them, and a rifle leaning against the desk, and a second chair that had been pulled close to the window to give a view of the street without being visible from it. "Calhoun Reese," he said, and did not offer his hand because both of them were already occupied checking the window again. "Sit down, Mrs. Holt." She sat. She took the letter from inside her dress and laid it on the desk. She put the folded paper with the 6 names beside it. He looked at both. He did not touch them yet. He looked at her. "Tell me about 2 mornings ago," he said. She told him. Flat and plain, the same way she had told Cecily, with no decoration and no sentiment, the facts in the order they had happened. He did not interrupt her. He listened all the way to the end and then he sat for a moment before he spoke. When he opened the letter, he read it twice. She watched his face. The first read, he was still. The second read, something moved behind his eyes, a kind of settling, like a man who has been waiting to hear a thing confirmed that he already suspected and is not pleased to be right. "Mrs. Holt," he said at last. "Yes." "Do you know what is on the list your husband made?" "I know there are 6 names. I know the word wrong. I know that Walt was not a man who underlined things without a reason." Reese nodded. "Your husband came to me 4 months ago." She had not known it was that long. She kept her face still. "He came because he had seen something at the land office. A filing. A deed transfer. He was there to register a water right on your South Creek and he was waiting at the counter and the clerk stepped away for a moment and Walt saw a file on the counter that was not his and he read the top page because he was an honest man and honest men do not think to look away from a piece of paper the way a dishonest man would have." "What did it say?" "It said that the Harrow family had sold their 800-acre stake to a land company called Meridian Holdings for a sum your husband immediately recognized as being less than a quarter of the land's fair value. He knew the Harrows. He knew that Thomas Harrow had a son who wanted to expand the cattle operation. He knew that Thomas Harrow was not a man who would sell that land at that price to a company he had never heard of. So he came to you. He came to me. I am a land examiner. I work for the federal government. I was in Blanton at the time doing an unrelated audit and Walt found my name from the hotel register at the front desk, which told him I was a federal man passing through town, which was the safest kind of man he could think of to approach." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I had been watching Meridian Holdings for 8 months. I told him that his instinct about the Harrow sale was correct and that it was not an isolated transaction. I told him that I believed there was coercion behind every sale on that list. Not outright theft. Coercion. Men being made to sign papers they did not want to sign and then leave the county before they could change their minds or speak to anyone. And I told him that the man running Meridian Holdings had a name, but that the name on the company filing was not his real name, and that I had not yet been able to prove the connection between the filed name and the real one. And Walt went home and made his list and wrote you a letter and put it under his porch step, and 6 months later someone came to his yard before sunrise. Yes, Mrs. Holt. I believe that is what happened. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Who is the man with the real name?" Reese looked at her. He looked at her with the careful measuring look of a man deciding how much of a weight to put on a person. She held his gaze and let him measure, because she had nothing to hide and no reason to pretend to be smaller than she was. "His name is Aldous Crane," Reese said. "He is the majority owner of the Blanton Cattle Bank. He is on the town council. He has been in this county for 12 years, and he is well regarded by people who have no reason to look under the surface of him. And he is a predatory and dishonest man who has been forcing marginal ranch families off their land for 3 years and consolidating their acreage under a company name that cannot be easily traced back to him. And the men who come to the yards before sunrise. He employs 3 men who do that kind of work. They ride for a foreman named Galt who has worked for Crane since before Crane came here. Galt is the man who makes people understand that signing the paper is the preferable option." She thought of Walt in the yard. She thought of the deliberate boots on the porch boards. "Mr. Reese," she said, "what were you waiting for? For months, what were you waiting for?" He looked at the window. He looked back at her. "I was waiting for testimony. I have documents. I have filings. I have paper evidence of 15 transactions that look wrong when you set them beside each other and impossible to explain innocently when you add the departure of the families afterward. But a federal case on land fraud requires witnesses. The families who signed are gone. Scattered. 2 of them I have been trying to locate for 3 months. The Harrows moved to Kansas. Another family to Colorado. These people were frightened, Mrs. Holt. They were made to be frightened, and it worked. Getting them back to testify means finding them first, which is slow, and it means convincing them to come back to a place where a man named Galt still rides, which is difficult. I watched Walt die, Nora said. Reese went still. I was under the wagon. I could not have gotten to him in time even if I had not been frozen with surprise, which I was for the first 30 seconds. But after that I was not frozen. I was remembering. What did you remember? For men. I will give you their descriptions. One had a scar on his right hand, the back of it a burn scar from the look of it, old and wide. One wore a brown duster with a tear at the left shoulder seam. The one who walked on the porch was the heaviest of the 4, and he wore a gray hat with a flat crown, and when he came out of my house he was carrying a tin of coffee beans that he had taken off my kitchen shelf, which I noticed because Walt's mother had painted that tin, and it had no value to anyone except our family. And that man took it because he was the kind of man who takes small things that don't belong to him because it gives him pleasure to do it. Reese had picked up a pencil. He was writing. The 4th man stayed with the horses the whole time, she said. He was young. I could tell by the way he moved when one of the horses shied. Young men move differently. He had a bay with 3 white socks. Reese set his pencil down. Mrs. Holt. Yes. You are a witness. I know what I am. I am also a woman whose husband is lying in his own yard because he saw a piece of paper he was not supposed to see and had the decency to think somebody ought to know about it. I would like to be useful in whatever way you require, and I would like it to amount to something by the end, and I want to be honest with you that if it does not amount to something, I am going to be very difficult to be around afterward. He almost smiled. Almost. You said Walt was not a man given to underlines, he said. He was not. He underlined the word wrong twice. Yes. You looked at his list. 6 names. I looked. Did any of them give you pause? She thought. She had read the 6 names twice in the fading light of the line shack. 5 of them were ranching families she knew by name and general acquaintance, the kind of knowing you develop over years of living in the same wide country as people without being their particular friends. The 6th name had made her stop. Harlan Webb, she said. Reese nodded. Harlan Webb sold his quarter section 8 months ago. I know this because Harlan Webb's wife is a woman I have known for 30 years. Her name is Patience, and she was the closest friend I have had in this part of the territory. And she did not tell me they were selling. She did not tell me they were leaving. One Sunday she was at church, and the following Saturday I rode out to pay a visit, and the house was empty, and a handwritten note had been pushed under the door of a neighbor saying they had gone to live with a daughter in New Mexico. No goodbye. No letter. Nothing. And I thought it was strange. I thought perhaps there had been some family difficulty I had not been made aware of. I thought perhaps the friendship had been less than I believed it to be on my side. I told myself people sometimes leave quietly because quiet is how they need to do it, and I put it away and I did not examine it further. And now I know that Patience Webb did not fail to say goodbye to me because our friendship was not what I thought it was. She did not say goodbye because she could not. Because someone had made it clear to her and to Harlan that not saying goodbye and not lingering and not speaking to anyone was the price of riding away from that quarter section still breathing. Nora stopped. Her voice had gone flat in the way of a voice that is managing something underneath it. She let a moment pass. And that makes me a different kind of witness, she said. Because I can tell a jury what kind of woman Patience Webb was, and I can tell them that a woman like that does not vanish from a 30-year friendship without a reason. And the reason she had was fear. Reese was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Holt, I have to tell you that being a witness in this kind of case is not a comfortable or safe position." "Mr. Reese," she said, "I rode 2 days on a borrowed horse after lying under a wagon counting feet. I am already not comfortable. Safe I let go of 2 mornings ago. You tell me what you need from me and I will tell you if I can provide it." He told her what he needed. Took most of the night. What he needed was a deposition. A formal witness statement of everything she had seen and everything she had heard and every descriptive detail she had stored. Written out and sworn to before a justice of the peace. He knew a man. Not the Blanton J.P., because the Blanton J.P. had a financial relationship with the cattle bank that Reese had already documented and did not trust. There was a justice of the peace in a town called Felder, 30 miles east, who was a former circuit judge who had retired to private life and who Reese believed to be clean. He also needed the 6 names confirmed. He had 5 of them already in his files. Walt's inclusion of Harlan Webb's name was the piece he had been missing, because the Webb transaction had been structured differently from the others, through a different subsidiary company, and Reese had not connected it to Meridian Holdings until this moment. He needed to move on Crane before Crane understood that Nora Holt was alive and in Blanton and talking to a federal land examiner in a room above a hardware store. The problem was Galt. Galt was not a man Reese could approach with a badge and a piece of paper and expect it to go smoothly. Galt was the kind of problem that required a different approach, which meant another person, which meant someone Reese trusted enough to put it Galt's back. He had one person, a man named Pryor, a deputy out of the county to the east who had worked with Reese before and who owed him nothing, which meant when Pryor showed up it was because he had decided to and not because he felt he owed it, which was the only kind of person Reese wanted beside him when it went hard. He could send for Pryor. It would take 3 days. 3 days, Nora said. 3 days. And in 3 days no one knows where I am. Ideally, no. You would stay here. Or if not here, somewhere I can reach you. She thought about the roan at the livery. She thought about the porch step empty back home and the tin box in her lap. She thought about Ned Dunbar sitting with Walt in the yard and the ground still too hard to work until someone came with proper tools. "Mr. Reese," she said, "I have a condition." He waited. "When this is done. When Crane is in custody and the case is made and the depositions are sworn and your paperwork is filed and whatever process follows from that has been set in motion. I want those families found. The ones on the list. I want them to know that the land question is not settled and that there is a process and that they can come back if they choose to or be made whole in some other form if they do not choose to. I want Patience Webb to receive a letter telling her that she can say goodbye now if she wants to. That she is allowed." Reese looked at her for a long time. "That is not strictly within my authority," he said. "Then get it within your authority," she said. "Or find someone for whom it is. Because these families were driven off their land by a man who made them believe they had no protection and no recourse and that the transaction they signed was the end of the story. I want them to know it was not the end of the story. I want them to know that somebody noticed and somebody came and somebody sat in an office for 3 days and told a federal man what they saw. Can you do that?" "I can try," he said. She looked at him the way she had looked at him when he was measuring her. Then she said, "Walt would have said the same thing. He would have said I can try and then he would have done it. I am going to assume you are the same kind of man. Reese said nothing. But he picked up his pencil again and he wrote something at the bottom of his page that she did not read, and something in the set of his shoulders changed a fraction, the way a person's posture changes when they add a thing to their list that they intend to carry through. The 3 days were long. She stayed in a room at the hotel that Reese had arranged under a name that was not hers. She ate her meals in the room. She sat at the window and watched the street because watching was the thing she did best and because there was nothing else to occupy her hands. On the second day she asked the hotel keeper's wife for thread and a needle, and she mended 3 items of clothing that had needed it for months. Because Walt had always done the mending and she had let it pile up in a corner and looked at it with the comfortable guilt of a woman who knows someone else will eventually see to it. Nobody was going to see to it now. She thought about that on the second evening. She sat with the needle and the last shirt and she thought about the shape of a life that had been built for 2 people and was now going to be lived by one. She was 61. She had come to the life she loved late, and she had known while she was living it that she was spending something finite. The way you spend the last of a good lamp's oil knowing there is no more. She had not been reckless with it. She had not wasted it or failed to be present for it. She thought she had done well by what she had been given. She was going to keep doing well by it. That was the only dignified thing. On the 3rd afternoon Reese knocked on her door with his hat in his hand and said that Pryor had arrived, and that there was someone else with Pryor who he wanted her to speak to. The someone else was a woman. She was younger than Nora by maybe 15 years, and she had the posture of someone who had been riding for several days, and the look of someone who did not intend to sit down until she had said what she came to say. Her name was Clara Harrow. She was Thomas Harrow's daughter-in-law. She had come from Kansas. She had come because Tom Harrow was dying of a cancer, and in his last weeks, he had decided that the thing he had not said was the thing he could not leave without saying. He had asked Clara to carry it because Tom's son, her husband, could not leave his father's side, and because Clara was the one in the family who, in Tom's words, had a spine made of the right material. What Tom Harrow wanted said was this: that the man who had come to the Harrow ranch a year ago had not made an offer. He had shown Tom a document that appeared to be a complaint filed in county court accusing Tom of water theft. The complaint was fabricated. Tom knew it was fabricated. The man had told him that the complaint would proceed to judgment and that the judgment would result in the seizure of the property for debt unless Tom signed the sale paper immediately. Tom had signed. He was 64 years old and tired, and his son had a young baby, and the idea of a legal fight against a man with the resources to manufacture court documents was more than Tom Harrow had believed himself capable of surviving. Tom wanted it known that he had not sold willingly. He wanted it in the record. He wanted, if there was a record, that his name was in it correctly as a man who had been robbed, not a man who had sold. Nora listened to Clara Harrow tell this, and she thought of Walt's face the evening he had come home from the land office. She had asked him if something was wrong because he was quieter than usual over supper, and he had said no, just a long day, and she had believed him, or had told herself she believed him, and now she understood that he had already started carrying something that he was deciding how to carry. She thought about the quiet weight of a thing a person carries for 6 months without putting it down. She thought about the porch step. She thought about 22 years of a man who listened all the way to the end of a sentence. Clara Harrow, she said. My name is Nora Holt. I was 2 mornings ago the only witness to my husband's murder by the men who work for Aldous Crane. I am going to testify to what I saw. I would be grateful if you would also testify to what your father-in-law has told you, and I would be grateful if you would write down, in your own hand, Tom Harrow's account of the document that was shown to him, so that it can be entered alongside his name in whatever record comes out of this. Clara Harrow looked at her. Then she sat down. She said, "Do you have paper?" They went to Felder the next morning. All of them, Reese and Pryor and Nora and Clara, and also the liveryman whose name was Graves and who had, it turned out, watched 2 of Galt's men ride through Blanton twice in the last 2 weeks and had noted the direction they came from and the direction they went and had written both things down in a ledger he kept behind the stall boards, because Graves was a man who had grown up in a county where a written record was sometimes the difference between justice and the absence of it. The justice of the peace in Felder was a small white-haired man named Allgate who wore his years in his face but not in his eyes, which were still the eyes of a man paying full attention to the world in front of him. He shook Nora's hand when Reese introduced her, and he held it a moment before he let go. "Mrs. Holt," he said, "I knew your husband's family a long time ago. His father was an honest man in a time when that was costly. She had not known that Allgate knew the Holts. She thought Walt probably would have known it and had not thought to mention it because it was the kind of small connection that Walt held quietly without attaching particular significance to it. She pressed her lips together and said, "Thank you," and meant it the way you mean things that cost you something to say. The depositions took most of the day. Nora's first. Every detail she had stored, from the sound of the horses in the dark to the tin of coffee beans with the painted flower on the lid. She did not embellish. She did not speculate. She gave what she had seen and heard and smelled and catalogued in the cold under the wagon, and she gave it plainly, the way Walt would have given it, all the way to the end. Clara Harrow's deposition came after. Then Graves. Reese had his own documents notarized. The paper evidence. 15 transactions. 3 years of filings. The chain of subsidiary companies running back to Meridian Holdings and from Meridian Holdings, through a set of connections Reese had been patiently unwinding for 8 months, to the Cattle Bank and to Aldous Crane. Allgate read everything before he signed his name to any of it. He took his time. He was a man who had learned, Nora suspected at considerable cost, that the speed at which a judge moves through a document is directly proportional to the quality of what comes out the other end. When he was done, he signed. He set down the pen. He looked at Nora. "Mrs. Holt," he said, "what you have done here is give this case what it did not have before, which is a human face and a human voice and an account that a jury will understand. Documents are necessary, but documents are cold. What you have given us is the truth in the form that truth becomes most effective, which is the testimony of a person who was present and who is not afraid to say plainly what they saw." She said, "Is it enough?" He looked at Reese. Reese said, "It is enough to move." Moving meant Pryor. Pryor and 2 men Pryor had brought from his county who were quiet, capable men of the kind who do not call attention to themselves before they are needed. They went for Galt first because Galt was the immediate danger and because without Galt, Crane was a man with paper evidence against him and no mechanism of intimidation left. They found Galt at the south end of the Crane cattle operation in a bunkhouse he appeared to share with 2 other men. The arrest was neither clean nor comfortable, and Pryor had a cut on his jaw afterward that he ignored. But Galt was in irons before supper, and the 2 men with him were shortly after. Crane was arrested at his home the following morning. He came to the door in a dressing coat, and the look on his face when he saw Pryor's badge and Reese's federal identification was not surprise. It was the look of a man who has been waiting for a door to open and has spent a long time deciding which face to wear when it did. He had settled on dignified. He was going for dignified all the way to the moment Pryor's man read the charges, at which point the dignity slipped, and what was under it was smaller and more frightened than the outside of Aldous Crane had suggested. Nora was not there for the arrest. She had not asked to be. She was at the Felder Hotel eating breakfast, the first real breakfast she had sat down to in 5 days, eggs and salt pork and coffee that was strong enough to have opinions, and she was eating it slowly and looking out the window at the Felder Main Street, which was beginning to wake up and fill with the ordinary traffic of an ordinary morning. Reese found her there. He came in and sat across from her and put his hat on the table and said, "It is done." She poured him coffee from the pot on the table. She watched him drink it. Then she said, "The families. I have already sent telegraphs," he said. "The Harrows in Kansas. The 2 families I was looking for. 3 others. I will find the rest inside the month." He paused. "And I have written a letter to Patience Webb in New Mexico." She looked at him. "I told her that her friend was well," he said. "That the situation which caused her to leave had been resolved. That if she wished to write a letter or make contact, she was free to do so. I told her that a woman named Nora Holt had asked that she be informed." Nora set down her coffee cup. She looked at the window for a moment. Outside, a woman was crossing the street with a child by the hand, and the child was pointing at a dog tied to a post, and the woman was shaking her head, and the dog was wagging with the tremendous optimism of a dog who has not yet been told no. "Thank you," Nora said. Reese nodded. Then he said, "Mrs. Holt, what will you do now?" She thought about that. She thought about the ranch on the Granger Flats. She thought about the creek with the water right that Walt had gone to register on the day he had looked at a piece of paper that was not his. She thought about the tin box and the watch in her coat pocket, Walt's father's watch, which she had wound every morning for the past 5 days because it was a watch and watches are wound and because keeping it running felt like a small act of continuity that she was not ready to give up. "I am going to go home," she said. "I am going to bury my husband. I am going to carry my water right properly. And then I am going to live on my land for as long as my knees allow, which I expect to be a considerable time because my knees are contrary and I do not intend to let them win." Reese almost smiled again. He was a man who kept his smiles close, she had decided, which meant the ones he produced were sincere. "There is a trial," he said. "You will be called to testify. I know it. It will not be easy." "Mr. Reese," she said, "I am 61 years old and I spent 22 years married to the most patient man I have ever known, who kept a terrible secret for 6 months to protect me from it and then got himself killed for it. Easy stopped being what I was aiming for a long time ago. What I am aiming for is useful. What I am aiming for is that Walt's list amounts to something. That those families get their land back or get made whole. That Aldous Crane sits in a federal courtroom and hears the evidence read aloud in a room full of people who believed him to be an upright man. That is what I am aiming for. That will happen," Reese said. "Good," she said. "Then I will come back for the trial. Until then you know how to find me." She rode home the following day. The long way, the ridge roads. She was not in a hurry and the roan was good company and the country was beautiful in the way that country is beautiful when you are paying attention to it instead of riding through it with your head down. She got home in the evening of the second day. Ned Dunbar had come back with 2 of his hands, and they had worked the ground and Walt was buried at the east end of the property where he had always said he liked to stand in the mornings because the light came in from that direction first. Ned had put a flat stone at the head of it. He had not carved anything into it because that was not his place. He had left the stone blank for her. She stood at the grave for a while. The evening was cool and the cottonwoods along the creek were making their sound in the small wind, and somewhere to the west a meadowlark was insisting on being heard. She had her hand on the watch in her coat pocket. "Walt," she said, "I did it. I carried your letter to your man and I sat under a lamp in a room above a hardware store and I told everything I saw and everything I heard and it is going to amount to something. It is going to be in the record. Your name is going to be in the record, spelled right, as the man who saw the wrong thing and had the decency to think someone ought to know. Because that is what you were and that is what you always did and I am not going to let it sit in an unmarked tin box under a porch step for the rest of history." She let a moment pass. The meadowlark kept on. She had spent a long time on the ride home thinking about something that Reese had said the first night, something she had not examined fully in the rush of the days that followed. He had said that Crane had relied on people believing they had no protection and no recourse, that he had built his entire operation on the assumption that isolated people on marginal land were too afraid and too alone to push back, that the architecture of his theft was made out of other people's silence, that each family who signed and left quietly made it a little easier for the next family to be pressured into signing and leaving quietly, because there was no visible evidence that anyone had ever said no or that saying no had ever led anywhere except to more trouble. She had thought about the tin box. She had thought about Walt going to Reese 4 months ago and then going home and keeping his mouth shut for 4 months while Reese built his case. And she had thought that Walt's silence in those 4 months was the same architecture as the other kind, the fearful silence, except that it wasn't, because the fearful silence ended when the pressure ended, when the paper was signed, when the family moved on, when the thing was done. Walt's silence had ended with a letter under a porch step and a trust that someone would carry it forward. The difference, she had decided somewhere on the ridge road on the first day, was not fear versus courage, because fear had been present in Walt's silence too. She would not pretend otherwise. She had heard the fear in him some evenings those last months. Heard it in the way he went quiet or checked the window or woke at sounds that did not require waking for. The difference was whether you believed your death would be the end of the thing. Walt had not believed that. Walt had believed that the truth of a thing, once written down and placed in a tin box in a person's care, could outlast the person. That it could travel on without him. That the right person finding it was not a matter of luck but of intention, because Walt had thought about who to write to and what to say and where to put the thing so that she would find it and understand what to do with it, and he had thought about all of this carefully and done it well, and the result was that the truth had traveled. She had carried it. Clara Harrow had carried Tom Harrow's piece of it. Graves at the livery had been keeping a quiet record of his own. A small piece of the pattern that no one had asked him for, and that turned out to matter. This was the thing about truth, she had decided. It was inconvenient to suppress completely because it had so many carriers. You could silence one person and the next person was already holding a piece of it and passing it to the person after that, and somewhere down the chain there was always a person who was not afraid enough to stop, or who was afraid but did it anyway, which was maybe the only definition of brave that had ever made practical sense. She stood at Walt's grave until the meadowlark stopped and the light had gone that particular amber it goes before it gives out entirely. Then she went inside. She built a fire. She heated water for coffee. She sat down at the kitchen table, which was her table and Walt's table and had been for 22 years, and she put the tin box in front of her and she opened it and she took out the pocket watch and she wound it. The trial came in the following spring. She rode to Blanton and she walked into the courthouse and she sat in the witness chair and she told what she had seen in a clear and level voice that did not tremble, which she had not been certain of until it was actually happening. The defense attorney was a city man who had been brought in from the East and who had a particular technique of implying that a witness of a certain age and a certain emotional state could not be trusted to accurately recall details under stress. He tried this technique on Nora Holt for approximately 4 minutes before he stopped trying it, because Nora Holt answered every question with the precise and unadorned accuracy of a woman who had spent 5 days lying under wagons and sleeping on floors and riding ridge roads specifically so that her testimony would not be wrong. And the jury could see that, and the defense attorney could see that the jury could see it, and he moved on. Clara Harrow testified. Graves testified. The two families Reese had found testified. The case was large and detailed and Reese had built it carefully over 18 months and it held. Crane took 22 years. Galt took 14. The others involved were sorted out in subsequent proceedings that Nora did not attend because by then she had done her part and the machinery of the law was turning under its own power. The land cases took longer. They always do. But they moved. 3 families got their land back inside the year. The others were made whole in other ways, by financial judgments against Crane's assets, which were considerable. The Harrow family came back to Wyoming. Tom Harrow died before the verdict, but Clara wrote to Nora that the doctor had said he was peaceful at the end, that the last weeks had been better than the middle ones, and that he had asked to hear the deposition read aloud to him on the day it came back in the mail and had listened to it all the way through without speaking and then had said, "Good," and closed his eyes. The letter from Patience Webb came on a Tuesday in June, 3 seasons after Nora had asked Reese to send word. It was 7 pages long. The first page and a half was apology, which Nora read once and set aside because apology was not what she had been waiting for and not what Patience owed her. The remaining 5.5 pages were 30 years of friendship conducted in the voice of a woman who had been holding it all back for the length of a hard winter and had now been given the warmth to let it out. Patience was well. Harlan was not entirely well, but he was alive and he was stubborn, which in Patience's view amounted to the same thing. She had 2 grandchildren she had not had the last time Nora saw her. She was growing tomatoes in New Mexico with limited success because the soil was wrong, but she was not giving up because she had never given up on anything in her life that was worth pursuing and she did not intend to start. She said she would like to come back someday and see the old places. She said she would like to sit on Nora's porch and drink coffee and talk the way they had used to talk, without urgency and without any particular destination, just the way you talk when you are comfortable with a person and the world has enough ordinary goodness in it to make it worth discussing. Nora read that sentence 3 times. Then she went to her desk. She got out paper and pen and she wrote back. She wrote that Patience was welcome on her porch any morning she chose to show up, and that the coffee would be strong and the view of the creek would be unchanged, and that she had a great deal to tell her about the past 2 years and she would rather tell it in person than on paper. She wrote one more line at the bottom. She said, "Walt said hello. I am certain of it." She sealed the letter. She addressed it. She put on her coat and she walked into town to post it, which was 3 miles each way on a June morning that was warm and clear and smelled of grass and distance and the 1,000 other things that make up the air in open country when the year is turning right. She thought, on the walk back, about what it meant to carry something. She had been carrying Walt's pocket watch every day since she had taken it from the tin box. She had not intended to. She had put it in her coat pocket on the ride to Blanton and it had simply stayed there, winding and ticking and marking time in the dark of her pocket where no one could see or hear it but where she could feel its weight when her hand brushed against it. She had thought sometimes that this was a kind of sentimental foolishness. A watch was a watch. Walt was not in the watch. The time it kept was the same time every other clock in the territory kept and had no particular association with the man who had owned it. But the weight was his. The feel of it in her hand was a thing she had watched his hand do 100 times, the particular habit of a particular man, and that specificity was not nothing. That specificity was the record. Not the official record, not the deposition and the court documents and the federal filings, though those mattered and she was glad they existed. But the private record. The 22 years of ordinary accumulation, the details of a shared life stored in the body of the person who had lived it alongside him. Not because anyone asked her to store them, but because love stores things without being asked. Because the mind of a person who loves another person is always making a record of small and unremarkable things against a day when they will be the only thing that remains. She had carried Walt's letter to his man. And she had carried Walt to Allgate's courtroom and to the witness chair and into the record. And she was carrying him now, on a June morning, on the road home, in the weight of a watch in her coat pocket and the memory of a man who listened all the way to the end. It was enough. It was not enough. Both things were true, and she had made her peace with the both of them. She got home before noon. She made coffee. She sat on the porch and she looked at the creek and she listened to the meadowlark, which was back or was a different meadowlark, she could not know which, and it did not matter. She was 61 years old. She was on her land. She had done what was asked of her, and more than that, she had done what was right, which was not always the same thing, but in this case had turned out to be, and she was grateful for that because it was not always so tidy. She thought about the 6 names on Walt's list. She thought about each one and where they were now. She thought about the families coming home and the ones who would not come home and the ones who had found something new in the places they had gone to and were maybe not sure anymore whether home was the word for what they had left or the word for what they had built. She thought that the word probably changed, that it probably shifted over the years of a life the way a creek shifts, not so much that it becomes unrecognizable but enough that you can see where it has been and where it is going, the old mark still visible in the ground even after the water has moved on. She sat on her porch and she drank her coffee and she watched the creek and she thought, Walt would have liked this morning. Then she thought, Walt does like this morning. He is in the record. He is in the ground. He is in the watch in my pocket and the water right properly filed and the 6 families being made whole and the man who took their land sitting in a federal cell thinking about what he believed would be easy and was not. Walt is here. He is all the way here. The watch ticked in her pocket. The meadowlark kept on. The creek ran the way it had always run, shallow and clear and indifferent to human events, which was not a coldness but a kind of permanence, the assurance that the ground itself does not take sides but simply remains, receiving whatever is asked of it, growing whatever is planted in it, carrying whatever moves across it toward wherever it is going. Nora Holt sat on her porch in the June morning light and she let herself be carried.